What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I'm super pumped for today's episode because in today's episode, we're going to talk about the predecessors to all of the modern day vegetables that we have today. A lot of you want to know kind of the backstory on how vegetables came to be. You know, how did a corn actually become a corn? Was it always a corn? The tomatoes we have today, were they always tomatoes? And same thing with things like peppers. You know, with the peppers, the big blocky bell peppers we have, how did they actually come to be? Well, I'm going to explain that, and it all starts with what we call landrace varieties. All right, so when it comes to things like pepper plants, you have your bell peppers, you have your jalapenos, and I think a lot of people just take them for granted because they think, well, it's a pepper plant. But there's actually a really important variety that is actually the predecessor to all of these varieties we've come to know and love. You see, you look at the leaves on this bell pepper plant here. This is the California Wonder Bell. And you'll notice the leaves are quite a lot larger. The plant is quite a lot stockier and bushier. And it's definitely been cultivated over the years to have traits that are preferable for us as gardeners or to farmers. Same thing with the jalapeno. So the jalapeno, yes, it's a little more spindly. It does have some of the characteristics, as we'll talk about, with some of the landrace varieties. But it's a little spindlier, but it's still, you can tell it's very cultivated for production. The way that it is bushier, the way that it is very, the center of gravity has been kind of cultivated to be very low to the ground, so it's not going to be blown over or snapped. It gives a lot of fruit, and the leaves are quite a lot larger as well. But let's check out a landrace variety, and then I'll talk about what a landrace variety actually is. So this is a landrace variety of pepper. Now this is known as the chiltepin pepper, and you'll notice from just a first glance that there's a lot different from these plants to some of the more domesticated varieties of peppers. You'll notice that the growth is much taller and much spindlier, has a much lower a much taller center of gravity. It's very top heavy and wobbly, but also the distance between the leaf nodes is much wider. There's also a big difference in the size of the leaves and even the size of the flowers. The flowers are so small, and the amount of flowers are so much less. And that's because this is a wild strain of pepper. This is known as the chiltepin, and the chiltepin is known as a landrace variety of pepper. Now, this pepper has been cultivated for thousands of years. However, this pepper has been basically crossbred and cross-pollinated with other wild varieties of peppers to essentially get to what we have today, which is our cultivated varieties of peppers. So this variety is responsible for all of the peppers that you've come to know and love today. And as gardeners, it is really intriguing, but it's also very important. This has such significance because these landrace varieties of peppers have quite a bit going for them that these other cultivated varieties do not. And I'll explain some of the benefits now to some of these wild varieties. So the first thing that these wild varieties provide to us as gardeners and the whole agricultural world in general is disease resistance. You see, you look at these domesticated varieties of peppers that are bred for beautiful large peppers, very sweet, crisp, high yielding plants. These are very disease prone. They get things like powdery mildew, blight. There's varieties. There's a disease called keystone disease, and there's so many other pepper diseases, pepper-related diseases that plague these weaker immune system pepper plants because they're bred not for the disease resistance, but they're bred for the size or the yield or the flavor, stuff like that. So we don't prioritize disease resistance, and so they have a lot of problems. But when farmers want to go back to finding varieties that are less disease prone, they're going to turn to these wild varieties. And why is that? Well, these wild varieties are very disease resistant because they've been growing with the diseases for thousands of years. And so they've become accustomed to being in the same environment as them. So they have to survive. They can't get things like powdery mildew at the smallest whiff of humidity. They have to fight through it. And so these varieties are tropical. They've been grown in the tropics in hot, humid weather for a super long time, and they just do not get it. And so when it comes to disease resistance, these provide the genetics. And what farmers will do, well, not really farmers, but agronomists and plant breeders, I guess you could call them farmers, but they will breed the genetics into these peppers for the disease resistance, and they will find the traits that they want from these wild strains, which are super important and are they've been the same for thousands of years, they will use these genetics to give the disease resistance to some of these varieties here that are more disease prone. And so this is a super important component of our wild varieties and why you should be growing them and having them in your garden. So check this out. Before we go into part 2 about what makes these landrace varieties so important to us, I want to show you just how they actually have been bred throughout history, because we actually have here, as I was realizing this, we actually have a timeline, a breeding timeline that just goes to show this wild variety being bred throughout a couple different varieties. So remember here, remember the spindly growth, the smaller leaves, the really spread out top canopy, the smaller flowers, right? Remember this. Now check this out. This is super cool. So this is a serrano. Right? A serrano is a slightly larger pepper, still quite spicy, but it's still more of that wild variety. You'll notice very tall plant, very top heavy. Look at the top growth here. See how wide this top canopy is? It really forms a wide canopy. It also has those super, super small flowers. Incredible how the genetics have been transferred over. Yes, it's been bred for those characteristics for that larger, longer pepper, slightly less spicy, slightly less seedy, a little more, kind of cultivated. But then go over to here. This is a jalapeno. You'll notice leaves get larger, flowers get larger. The flowers get like 3 times the size of even the other 2 varieties. The fruit also gets substantially larger. You get slightly less fruit, but you'll notice far less spread on the canopy. The plant is actually far stockier. It's way more balanced. It's less spread out. Then check out this variety of pepper. This is the California Wonder. Now look at this. Yes, the plants are slightly larger, but look at how big the leaves are. Look at the canopy. Look how tight the canopy is. And look at the flowers. Check this out. The flowers are giant. They're probably 2 to 3 times larger than even the jalapeno, then probably 4 times larger than the serrano, and probably 6 times larger than the chiltepin. So you can see here how as the pepper gets larger and sweeter, it gets more domesticated. The more domesticated you get, the more the plant looks like a completely different vegetable. I would not look at this and this pepper if you would have told me that they're the same strain. Obviously they're both peppers, but they look like completely different plants to just the untrained eye. You'd say, there's no way these are both peppers. If you were an alien coming from outer space, you would not say that these are the same plant. They look completely different. And that is those traits that are being bred out from the chiltepin for the characteristics that we want in a sweet bell pepper. Really, really fascinating. Absolutely incredible how we have that timeline there. And that timeline has taken place over many, many, many years. And it's something that we have just kind of, we've done because we want something. Once we find what we want, we select that, we prioritize it, and then we are given all these wonderful varieties. Super cool. So the second thing that these landrace varieties provide us is pest resistance. So we talked about with the peppers, how they had a lot of disease resistance, but landrace varieties, even like this landrace variety of tomato, provides us tons of pest resistance. Pests like aphids, whiteflies, spider mites, some of your more garden-friendly pests that affect some of your kind of more domesticated varieties of tomatoes, these landrace varieties are very prone, or they're very resistant to them, right? They're not as prone to the pests. And that's what I think is really awesome about growing some of these landrace varieties, is that they will basically stand above all the rest when everything else gets aphids or whiteflies or spider mites, things like that. These varieties will simply just be like, what pests? And that's again for the same reason we talked about with the disease resistance, is that these varieties have been grown for thousands of years. They've grown on their own. They don't need someone to cultivate them and to breed them for certain characteristics. These varieties have been grown for just thousands of years on their own wild, and they are actually, they're very hardy, right? So this is the Tess's landrace currant. And much like the peppers, you'll notice so much differences with this plant, particularly actually, and well, very similarly to the landrace pepper, the chiltepin, you'll notice the spindliness of the plant, right? We've not pruned this. It is single stemmed, so we've pruned it to a single stem, but we haven't taken off any leaves here. You'll notice they are just so spread out. The leaflets are so much smaller, and the fruit is so much longer. The truss that holds the tomatoes is super long. and only has teeny tiny little tomatoes on it. And so in the wild, it doesn't need to have a really short, stocky truss, because what does a short, stocky truss do? Well, it holds lots of fruit. I'll show you that in a second with some hefty beefsteaks. But see, the longer the stem, the less weight it can hold. But also, the longer the stem, the more the blossoms can get out there for pollinators, right? It relies really heavily on pollination so that it can produce fruit. So the trusses are really long, and the fruit is really small. Why is that? Well, that's because of birds. Birds will eat the fruits and spread the seeds. And so the fruits are really, really small in comparison to some of your other more domesticated varieties of tomatoes. Even other cherry tomatoes, this pales in comparison. I mean, this is like the size of it's smaller than a marble. It's about the size of like a hefty pea, really. And so that's as big as they're gonna get. Now, you also notice too, the plant is not as stocky, right? The trunk is not as thick. Why is that? Well, that's because tomatoes are a vine, and tomatoes in the wild wouldn't necessarily grow like English ivy. They won't they won't twirl and twine, but they will crawl along the ground and set down roots everywhere the plant touches the ground. And so it's very advantageous to actually grow and sprawl and spread. And you can grow and sprawl and spread a lot faster with a thinner stem. And so the stem is thinner, the leaves are smaller, the branches are more spread out. And again, that also is another thing too. Biologically, these landrace varieties, they're bred because in thick canopies, when they're fighting for sunlight, you can't have a lot of leaves all in one location because you're going to be fighting for that sunlight. So what this does is it spreads out so that it can actually get that sunlight in sparser areas. And you can see that right in the genetics of this plant. It's incredible, so fascinating. So come in, check it out. I'm going to show you this up close, and then we're going to check out some of the other beefsteak varieties, the more domesticated varieties, and kind of compare and contrast those. All right, so this is a beefsteak variety of tomato, and you'll notice how much different the actual flowers look, the truss looks, even the fruit looks, everything looks so much different. And that's because it's bred for a larger, heftier, juicier tomato. You'll notice the truss is super small, and that's because of the weight, right? You want the weight to be closer to the stem so that as the tomatoes get larger, it doesn't break the truss. But also, you'll notice the flowers are substantially larger. You'll notice that, that there's substantially less flowers per truss. There's only like 3 or 4 per truss here, and that's because, weight and stuff like that. You also notice, look at how close the stems are to each other, right? Look at this, much closer together, and the leaves are so much larger of a plant, so much larger leaves, so much closer together. It is clearly a tomato, but it's vastly different from the landrace variety. So this incredible world of wild varieties can be found in not just tomatoes and peppers, but you can find it in everything from melons to cucumbers to lettuce as well. There's so many different varieties of wild landrace strains of vegetables. And what I would encourage you to do is add some to your garden, because not only are they very important for those genetics, we want to keep those genetics around. We want to actually experience and learn about them, taste them, but also the third thing that these varieties provide is true natural flavor. You see, a lot of these domesticated varieties, they've been bred for things like shape or size or yield, right? They've been prioritized for the farm to produce a lot so you can take them to market. Even a lot of our heirloom varieties have been bred for certain things. It could be unique colors and flavors and stuff like that. But you get further away from the real wild natural flavor of the vegetable the more you domesticate it. And I like to go back to the analogy of that every dog has a certain percentage of Chihuahua, right? Try this. It's crazy. Look at the genetics of your dog if you have one, or just go on Google and type in what percentage of the American Pit Bull is Chihuahua, right? It's insane how much. There's like 60% of the genetics of every dog is Chihuahua. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And it just goes to show that the American Pit Bull looks absolutely nothing like a Chihuahua. Nothing in shape, size, face, nothing. However, this beefsteak tomato looks nothing like a landrace currant tomato. And the bell peppers look nothing like a chiltepin whatsoever. But yet I would probably wager to say that about 60%, if not more percentage of the genetics of the sweet bell peppers or any of your tomatoes, your beefsteaks and stuff like that is the actual genetics of the wild varieties. And so it's super great to be able to taste what that wild variety tastes like because it's so much different, but yet it's so similar in the fact that it's still a tomato, it's still a pepper, it's still, you know, a lettuce or a cucumber. And so, yes, it's great to try. Yes, it's important to grow, but it's also really, really important, like I said, coming back full circle to us as the gardener, it's really important to know where these varieties actually came from because it helps us to understand the garden at a deeper level. It also helps us to understand the importance of biodiversity because something we talk about all the time on this channel is that if you lose biodiversity, you lose the ability to have all these amazing varieties. And then you're left with like what? One? And if that one fails, it's gone. And so biodiversity is the most important thing that we really try to talk about here. And that's one of the wonderful things about heirlooms as well. So I hope you guys found this intriguing and exciting. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments box down below some wild varieties of vegetables or flowers or plants that you're growing in your garden. I'd love to know. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care.